Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anna Zongola. I'm representing the AAMC. Thank you all for joining our session today on writing an impactful personal statement. Today, an associate dean and two pre-health advisors will share their advice and expertise on this important part of the application. As a reminder, we will take questions at the end of the session, so feel free to post your questions in the chat. Also, this session will be recorded for those who cannot listen live. Today, we have with us Jason D'Antonio, Assistant Teaching Professor and Director, Health Professions Program at Carnegie Mellon University, Yvette Perry, Associate Dean for Admissions and Strategic Enrollment at the University of Toledo College of Medicine, and Ellen Steinman, Director of the Office of Pre-Professional Programs and Advising at Johns Hopkins University. First, we'll get started with Jason and Ellen sharing their perspectives as advisors.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us today. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So, as you know, we're talking about personal statements, and we're really excited to be here, all three of us, to have that conversation with you today. The first thing we have to do is define what is a personal statement. So a personal statement, as you can see here, it's a short narrative that describes your key life experiences that illustrate your journey to medicine and readiness. It is all about you. So notice it's your journey illustrating your story. And it's really important that you keep that in mind, that personal component of the personal statement. Next. So why is a personal statement so important? So oftentimes it can be the main introduction to you as an applicant. And I know Dr. Perry is going to talk about this a little bit later, so I won't say too much. But sometimes medical schools do read your personal statement first. And it is your first personal introduction. It is your personal narrative. I keep saying you and personal because it does help set you apart from other applicants. And it can describe what is motivating you to go into medicine and what makes you a compelling applicant. When we talk about the personal statement, we have to make reference to the AMCAS applicant guide. The AMCAS applicant guide, when you apply, is it is the tell-all. It is your Bible to medical school admissions. It is a complete information on how the application process works. And there's a section in there on the personal statement. We can tell you that the personal statement is 5,300 characters, and there is no specific prompt. The AMCAS applicant guide does have some leading questions, and we invite you to take a look at that AMCAS applicant guide a little bit later today. You can do a Google search for that. And so you can see that the types of guiding questions that might help you think about some topics and how you want to write your own personal statement. But you really have to give, in general, great thought to the personal statement because it does put a lot, or medical schools do put a lot of weight on that essay. It's super important. Next slide. Okay, so before we get started and go too deep into all this, we have to talk about elements of a strong personal statement. And we have to talk about how to get started in writing your personal statement. So think about what qualities would you want to share with readers? What do you want the medical schools to know about you? And a good starting point for that is to look at the AAMC's core competencies for entering medical school students. So there are 15 core competencies. If you're not familiar with that, you could take a look at that online as well. When you're looking up the AMCAS applicant guide, you can also look up the AAMC's core competencies. We think that's a great starting point to think about what are these qualities, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and then there's scientific inquiry. There's a lot that goes into these different skills and knowledge and abilities that medical schools, these attributes that medical schools are looking for. You also want to think about what experiences you want to share with the readers and with the medical schools. And a good way to start with this whole process is either mind mapping. If you've never done that, there's some online exercises about mind mapping, but mind mapping or just listing, brainstorming, what qualities and what experiences do you want to share? And then see what themes start to emerge and whittle your themes down and your ideas down from that. Next. So let's take a minute to just talk about the components of your personal statement. When you put it together, what's it going to look like? Well, there's going to be a clear introduction, a middle, and a conclusion. And when we talk about the introduction, Jason and I are going to talk in a few minutes. We're going to share some intros from our own students, our own examples in a later slide. But when we talk about that introduction, you want to start with a story as a way to introduce yourself. Sometimes it's not related to medicine at all, but sometimes it is. And again, we're going to show you some different examples in a few minutes. But all of this ties into your theme and your qualities as an applicant. And then you come to the middle, right? The next section of your personal statement. Then you're supporting your theme and you're showing, you're illustrating your theme, your qualities, your experiences. You want to use descriptors. You want to describe your role in the experience, describe the setting, the people, the challenges, the outcomes. You want to paint a picture in the reader's mind. And I know this is a hard exercise for a lot of students to do. It can be very challenging to write about ourselves, but you've got to dig deep and you have to go beyond some of the surface level explanations that you might just use in regular conversation. You have to paint that picture for your reader. And then the last section to your personal statement is your conclusion. Oftentimes our applicants will tie back into their introduction. You want to summarize your perspectives, your growth, how you have changed, how you've evolved as an applicant. Super important to bring all that together. And then the whole thing flows, and the entire essay should flow, your theme should flow, your paragraph should flow from one to the next. And it's super important to keep that in mind. If you can hit next on the slide for a second. These themes should flow to tell your story. So in other words, we don't necessarily, and Jason's going to talk in a minute about do's and don'ts, we don't necessarily we're not looking for a narrative of your resume, and we're not looking for each paragraph to sort of stand alone so that one paragraph would be on research and the next one might be on community service. That's not necessarily what we're looking for. We're looking for a story, and sometimes it's the simplest of stories, but it's told in the best, most detailed way. And the last thing I want to just say on here is that many of our pre-meds have similar experiences. We know that you've been in research, in community service and clinical experiences, and you're in student groups and clubs, but there's only one personal statement that is uniquely yours, and there's only one you. And I want you to embrace that uniqueness as you're writing your personal statements and thinking about what's going to set you apart and what's going to make you compelling as an applicant. So in our next slides, we're going to give you some examples of introductory paragraphs. I'm going to read two that are more family-based, personal-based, and then Jason's going to read two that are a little different. He'll explain his in just a second. So if we can show the first intro paragraph. So I'm going to read this one out loud. And if you could take a minute to sort of sit back, relax, close your eyes, maybe visualize what I'm about to tell you. Okay, so you can sort of envision this occurring, this person writing this paragraph. The slam of the bathroom door shook our apartment. I heard the lock click and I huddled in my bedroom, watching my nightlight flicker. My brother's voice shook the walls as he shouted that he had locked himself in with a knife and to leave him alone. The next sound I heard was the scrape of our super's tools as he removed the lock off the bathroom door from the outside, attempting to comfort my parents while he worked. Since that night, I have been writing. So it sort of leaves you pausing. It's very personal. It is a personal statement. That's a very personal thing for someone to share. And then she goes on. This happened to be somebody who was a medicine, science, and humanities major, does a lot of writing, and she started to journal, and she starts talking about her different experience. She goes into more detail with other experiences, and she does tie in her family and some personal issues within her family. So it was a personal statement. Can we go to the next one? Okay, again, so if you sort of imagine reading this, I have always been short. Not too concerning for me as a child, but a bigger deal when I had to tilt my head back to make eye contact with the girls I liked. My older brother, an aspirational 5'10", was my promise that genetics would come through for me, that I was just one growth spurt away from above average stature. Toward the end of high school, though, it became clear that 5 feet and 4 inches were all puberty could muster for me. So the thing with this personal statement, he went on, so this particular person was an EMT on campus, and he went on to talk about one night, one particular incident, one student who had a mental health problem, and he wrote about her, the scenario, what unfolded that night, and his interactions, how he was a patient advocate. As an EMT, he was advocating for a patient while the Baltimore City Police were waiting outside and campus security were waiting outside. And here's this big officer who's like 6 foot something, and here's the student who's 5'4". And he had to be, as I said, that patient advocate. And that's what he wrote about. He didn't write about his research. He and I actually, this particular one stood out for me because he came in the first time with a very, I would say, basic personal statement, a paragraph about research, a paragraph about something clinical. And it wasn't particularly compelling. And we brainstormed, we sat here in this office and we just talked it out. And he came up with this idea and the challenges that he sometimes had to have and the way he has to speak up, and his stature cannot define who he is. It's a part of who he is, but it doesn't define who he is. So this ended up being a very compelling personal statement. Again, personal about this individual and his challenges and how he has turned those challenges into a positive. So Jason, I'm going to turn it over to you for your examples now.
Excellent. Thanks, Ellen. So as we think about these next 2 sample introductory paragraphs, keep in mind again some of the things that Ellen talked about. What's the purpose of the personal statement, how it's structured, and one thing that you'll notice is that these introductory paragraphs are quite short, and I think it's a good thing to keep in mind. A nice short introductory paragraph that captures the attention of the reader serves as a good tool. So go ahead and hit the next button here. And like before, if you can, close your eyes and imagine being this student or this individual. You hear a beep. The sound of the bulletproof door alarm is unmistakable as it opens to the County Juvenile Detention Center. As I pass through the metal detector on the way in, I hear, "Hey, Miss G, looking fly today." Meet Devon, an 18-year-old on state-mandated behavioral probation, working to finish the 10th grade. When we first met, he was struggling through an online civics assignment, and I taught him how to copy and paste on a computer for the first time. He called it life-changing. So did I. This is an applicant in our pool. Again, we got permission to use these statements, who really enjoyed being a TA. She really enjoyed teaching individuals math and science. And she found this unique experience where she was able to combine not just community service, but teaching and her love of mentoring. It turned out when she did this experience, it was quite profound in getting her to think about the impact that she can have, even as a college student. She doesn't have any clinical training. She has never been trained as a teacher or a TA, but utilizing her education, building on her communication skills and her confidence, she found that she could have a significant impact on the quality of life for these young men in this setting. And this really captured my attention, at least as a pre-health advisor, in getting to read the next statement, wanting to know where was she going to go with this and how was she going to connect all of her other lived experiences, whether it be research, community service, and the clinical setting, of course. So this was one of my favorite statements, and I think it really caught my attention. Let's go to the next one and compare how this statement reads. I held her toothbrush in my hand, unsure of what to do with it. Everyone knows how to use a toothbrush. In this case, though, I was standing uncertainly in the middle of the psych surgical ward at MedStar George Washington Hospital because Rosemary had just asked me to use her toothbrush to comb her hair. So now imagine that you are an undergrad student or a pre-health student applicant, you're volunteering, and you imagine All right, reading this, I know exactly what a toothbrush is for. Where is this individual going with this statement? And then all of a sudden you can imagine, I mean, being right there next to Rosemary and this individual, hearing this individual with maybe perhaps some mental health issues or mental health concerns, asking you to brush her hair with a toothbrush. And immediately you realize that there's some kind of personal connection. And how do you as an applicant, as an individual, as a college student, relate to someone like Rosemary or others who live a very, very different life than you do? So again, a short emotional connection. It's not anything complex. Like Ellen mentioned, it's a simple statement, but it captures your attention as a reader, wanting to know, where are we going to go next? Okay, next slide. So what I'd like to do is provide a couple of brief do's and don'ts as you think about strategizing and developing your personal statement. Before writing, it's very important to sit back, take some time, and reflect on what you've accomplished, what you've learned, the classes you've taken, the people you've met, and the experiences you've had. As you're drafting your personal statement, always be mindful of who your audience is going to be reading this statement. It could be physicians, it could be members of the community, it could be research advisors or professors at a medical school and the like. So be mindful of who your audience is, but always write about things that you'd like to write about. I believe that most life experiences that you've had are proper topics for the personal statement, and we'll hear more about strategies about how to write about more sensitive topics. But at the end of the day, it really depends on how you write about them that counts the most. Next. When you're describing your past experiences, I always encourage applicants to be very positive about what you've experienced. A good example is I often work with a lot of engineers at Carnegie Mellon University. And sometimes there may be a tendency to describe something like my previous summer internships in engineering as a worthwhile experience. However, I didn't feel like I was really impacting people's lives. And rather than saying that, I always encourage them to bring out the positive in their engineering training or their humanities training and talk about the skills, the competencies that Ellen mentioned earlier on that you learned or gained from those past experiences. Right? In writing the personal statement, try to give a sense of your personality, perhaps your priorities, your interests, the things that you really care about, and then describe them, bring them to life, as Ellen mentioned. Use good examples to illustrate and not just tell, but really try to show. Use a few illustrative points to bring your experiences to life, like those intro statements that we just read. You can almost imagine being there, watching these experiences unfold. Next. If you begin with a thesis, refer to it at your closing. And we gave you a couple of examples that had sort of an emotional beginning to it. But sometimes students use a thesis at the beginning. It's nice to bring that back and close at the end. When in doubt, always edit for spelling, edit for grammar. But keep in mind, don't shoot to be overly poetic or overly complex. Don't use words that are not necessarily used in your daily talking, like plethora or myriad. I always recommend keep it simple. Be mindful of who's reading it, and just tell your story, keep it simple, and don't make it too complicated. Okay, next slide. So thinking about things that you probably should avoid, I definitely recommend do not writing out your resume as a prose narrative. You don't want to simply just say, I've done this, I've done that, I've accomplished this, I've accomplished that. You want to try to draw some illustrative examples and create a story with some flow, like Ellen had mentioned. Of course, absolutely do not plagiarize. And as we move into the next stage of technology in our lives, ChatGPT is something that we really recommend that you strongly avoid. It's really important that the personal statement is a product of your own creativity and a reflection of your lived experiences. Next. Okay, and things to avoid, like I kind of already mentioned, you don't need to be really creative. I would personally recommend avoiding controversial topics, politics, religion, trying to sound too perfect. Right? Avoid redundancy, and that comes up sometimes when applicants write, I did this, I did that, a lot in their statements. I mentioned already, try to avoid exotic vocabulary. And something that I definitely recommend is avoid preaching to doctors about being a doctor, or preaching to dentists about being a dentist, telling them what's important to be a doctor or what it's required of them. Just talk about your experiences and how you've gained life skills in preparing yourself for medical training and a career in healthcare. I think starting your personal statement with, I've always wanted to be a doctor since I was fill in the blank, 2 years old, 3 years old, 7 years old. It sounds nice, but it's always a little bit questionable when we wonder, how much do you actually remember when you were that age? And then to wrap things up, I would definitely suggest recommend avoiding too many quotes in your personal statement, maybe perhaps too much storytelling or really lengthy anecdotes that take up too much time. I think the key is to use these wisely, capture your audience's attention, be creative, but get back to your story, get back to what you've learned and how you've grown and how you've matured and how your lived experiences have prepared you for a career in medicine. So with that, I'd like to transition to the next set of slides.
And before we turn to Dr. Pear, we can just switch the presentation to presentation mode. Just give us a minute. We're switching viewpoints.
Sure, no problem, no problem. Well, I will start talking because I can't stand all this silence in a presentation. So I will introduce myself. My name is Dr. Yvette Perry. I'm the Associate Dean for Admissions and Strategic Enrollment at the University of Toledo College of Medicine and Life Sciences in Toledo, Ohio. There we go. Wonderful. Thank you. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to really briefly reiterate everything my colleagues have said about the personal statement. In your application, you have told us a lot of information about who you are, your grades, your the courses you have taken, research you might have conducted, all of these things. So we already have access to that. So the point of view of the medical school is we have all this. Remember, we have your application, we have your AMCAS application that you've spent hours and hours on. But what we're trying to get at with the personal statement is, who are you? Who is this person who wants to apply to our medical school, potentially be part of our class, part of our cohort, and be a physician in the future? So that's really what we're getting to. And on the next slide, I just want to ask you this, just really state that what we're trying to get at is behind all of these things, behind the GPA, behind the activities, behind all of this. So just keep that frame in mind, that that's what we're looking for. It's almost like, I don't know how many of you play video games or something like that. If you think about an avatar, your version of yourself that goes out into the video game world to slay dragons and do whatever y'all do when you're playing the video games. This is like your avatar to the medical schools. You have to overlay something that would give us an idea of who you are in a very brief period of time, okay? So think avatar. All right, let's look next. You kind of already have the answer to this. At what point in the application cycle will the medical school admissions personnel, maybe the staff in the office or the admissions committee, when will they read your AMCAS personal statement? Okay, so think that to yourself. Do you think it's during the second, when they're trying to decide whether or not to give you a secondary application for specific to their school? Is it when they're deciding whether or not to invite you to interview? Deciding whether or not to accept you, maybe accept you from the wait list? Well, as the next slide shows, it really can be read at any point in time. Next slide. Any point in time, at any stage in the cycle, your personal statement from your AMCAS application may be read. Now, having said that, though, the next slide, I think the two biggest places is going to be when they're trying to decide whether to invite you for an interview or when to, after you've interviewed, whether or not to accept you. A lot of times the secondary application decision is a little bit faster because obviously medical schools have thousands and thousands of applications. So they're not going to read every single thing. So they just may read a very brief holistic review of your AMCAS application, or some medical schools send AMCAS applications to every single person. But the two key pieces, the two key places are going to be deciding whether to invite you for an interview and accepting you or not accepting you or waitlisting you. So those are the two most key places where your statement might be read. All right, next slide. So the whole point is, what are medical schools looking for in this statement? Let's go ahead and turn there. Go ahead, next slide. So these are the things, you've heard some of this information, but I'm going to kind of give you from my point of view here. The number one thing is honesty and authenticity. This goes with all of the things that you heard from my colleagues there. You know, not AI driven, not, you know, that you paid someone $1,000 to write your statement. We're trying to get to know you. We want to know who you are. And so your honesty and authenticity is just key. When you have read thousands and thousands and thousands of applications, trust me, you get to, I'm going to watch what I say, but your BS meter is very, very sensitive. Trust me, trust me, trust me. So please, I would rather have a statement that's not incredibly creative and beautiful like the ones that you've read, that you've heard from Jason and Ellen. I would rather, and most of my committee members would rather, something straightforward and honest, rather than something that sounds beautiful but sounds like, you know, maybe you know, a script writer on an HBO showrunner has written it. So honesty and authenticity are key. And remember, just, you know, when you're signing that AMCAS application, you are testifying basically that all the words you have written are your own. So just keep that in mind. This is an integrity issue as well, right? And maybe we will never find out. But just think, if you want to be a physician, you want to show integrity. So please, honesty and authenticity at the bare minimum. Clarity and lack of errors, you've already heard this. There's nothing worse than reading a personal statement that's just full of errors. It can be very challenging to write something that's completely clear and free of errors. I recommend, you know, if you have pre-health advisors, if you have other folks who can look at them to make sure that you, you know, don't count on, you know, autocorrect. The funny story I have in this, one time I had a very, otherwise very wonderful personal statement where the person said that they received their bachelorette degree from University X, and I know they meant baccalaureate, but I don't think they meant bachelorette degree, but it's just one of those things, and it was spelled correctly, but that's not what they meant, and it just made for humor where probably they did not intend to be humorous. The question, the main question there, you can answer whatever question you want to, but one of the things that we're trying to get a sense of is, why medicine for you? You're obviously a bright, brilliant, dedicated person. Why medicine? This is a hard field to go into. It is challenging. Are you in it for the long haul? Why do you want to do this? Why do you want to put yourself through this? So it's whatever topic you choose is fine. There is no assigned topic, but one of the things, if you think of, is why medicine. That would be a nice place to start. Dr. D'Antonio did talk about this already, but the specific, we want to know about you. You know, whatever story and whatever wonderful thing you end up creating, one of the things you might do is just look at it with an eye towards how much of this is actually about me, how much of it is setting up a story, how much of it is about my grandfather that was in the hospital, and then there's only 2 lines about why that forced me or made me want to go into medicine. We really want the point of view to be from you. We really want to get to know you. And again, the character, the number of characters that Ms. Sneidman talked about may sound like a lot. I don't know if that sounds like a lot or a little to you, but it really isn't a whole lot of room. So we want to make sure you shine through. It should be a supplement to your application. Now I'll share with you, some admissions committees, some admissions offices, they will, everyone who reads your application will read all parts of it. Other folks, they might, you know, send some pieces out to different people. So someone may be just looking at personal statements. Some admissions committee members may have their workflow. They want to read, let's say they're evaluating 6 applications at one time. Maybe they look at all 6 personal statements first and then go back and look at, you know, activities. And so there are a million different ways that different admissions offices and admissions committees might slice and dice that AMCAS application. But at the very least, you want to make sure it's a supplement to your application, not a restatement of your application. It should work on its own, just in case the person getting that, it doesn't have access to your whole application. Okay. And then this final thing, and I want to leave plenty of time for us to talk in the Q&A, but we really do want to see some evidence of kind of mature self-reflection. Again, I keep making this point, this is a long road, a very rigorous road, and we want to see maturity, especially a lot of medical schools are moving more towards early clinical experiences. So we want to see right away that you have the maturity to be able to interact with patients, interact with colleagues. So we can get more into that. What do I mean by that specifically? We can talk more about that in your Q&As. I kind of glanced at the Q&A, so your questions, so I see some very great questions that we can get into. Next slide. The last thing I just want to touch on are, some potential hazards, and I saw some of these questions in there. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail right at this point, because hopefully that can come out in the Q&A in the specific situations. But potential hazards might be kind of red flags. That's one of them. So let's say it's low grades or lower MCAT score, or you took MCAT multiple times, other kinds of kind of red flags. Okay, so I'm not going to say include it, don't include it, but I will encourage you to ask yourself these questions. First, is there a more appropriate place to discuss this information? Okay. If you have, for example, an institutional action, the appropriate place to discuss that is the item in AMCAS that says, do you have an institutional action? You have a text field where you can describe what that is about. Admissions committees will see that and be able to put that into context. You probably do not need to reiterate that in your personal statement, but ask yourself, is there a more appropriate place to discuss this? Are you required to disclose this information? Again, institutional actions, you are required. Criminal, any kind of criminal thing that would come back on a criminal background check, you do. And so again, have you fully disclosed that in the appropriate item? Has the situation been resolved? For example, if you had issues adjusting to college and you decide that you want to discuss that, make sure it's resolved. Make sure your statement isn't, I'm still working on this, and hopefully by the time I get to medical school, it'll be all better. That should not be the story. But if it has been resolved, you might be able to discuss this as a positive instead of a negative. This can show, go back to those competencies that Ms. Sneidman talked about. It can show your resilience. It can show your ability to be a self-directed learner. It can show all of these competencies if you can show that it has been resolved. And then finally, by all means, be sure if you do decide to discuss something that it's not blaming, my professors didn't like me, you're not making excuses, you're not trying to be the victim or anything like that. Those are some of the things that I would suggest that you just ask yourself. And again, I will stop there, and hopefully some of this will come up, and the three of us can talk about, how we handle these and what advice we give, because I think the specifics will be a lot more beneficial.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. Now we'll take a look at the questions that have come in. Wow, we've over 100. The first question is, I grew up in an area where crimes, drugs, and poverty prevailed. Is there such a thing as oversharing? How these factors affected me throughout my journey to medicine?
Oh, I can start us, and this is another thing that it's up to you, but there is actually another place in the application where you can talk about disadvantage, and you're allowed to say a little bit about that. But in some cases, that might be a big reason why you decided to go into medicine. And so if so, I think that can become part of your story. Again, what was it specifically? But I think, I can't remember whether Jason or Ellen talked about this. What you're not doing, though, is spending 3 paragraphs educating us about social determinants of health, or this isn't a research paper. This isn't a paper for a class. So make sure if you do bring up something like that, it's from your perspective, and you very quickly go into what your role was, how you've overcome it, why that impacted you specifically, how you've had to grow and so forth. So I will leave it there, and maybe Ellen and Jason want to weigh in on some of the things they've seen with their students.
I'm only gonna unmute if I really have something different to contribute, given the time and all the questions. Okay, I'll just throw that out there. Great answer.
Agreed.
Okay, we'll go to our next question. Should the stories used in the personal statement be the same or different from the stories we use in the 1,300 meaningful character paragraphs?
I can take this one. I usually recommend to applicants that you can absolutely sort of repurpose and reuse topics from the primary application of the personal statement. But it's always important, I think, that you put them into a new perspective, use different wording, go into depth, maybe draw out a different meaning that you articulated in the primary application, talk about it in a slightly different way. Of course, your most meaningful experiences are most meaningful. They're incredibly impactful. And I would expect at least some of them to be in the personal statement. You definitely do not want to copy and paste, though.
Would the personal statement of an older, non-traditional applicant be weighed more heavily in the overall application than it would be in a traditional younger applicant?
Oh gosh. I mean, it's hard I don't think that it would be weighed more heavily, less heavily. But this might be more important for you in that this gives you an opportunity to really discuss. Maybe there isn't a whole lot of other places in the application for you to discuss what you've done in those times, how those experiences have contributed to your desire to go into medicine, how you've grown. So I wouldn't say that on our end, on the medical school's end, it's necessarily something like, oh, this person is, 38. We really need to look at their personal statement with a fine-tooth comb. But it could be to your advantage to really use that to show that avatar of who you are. So I would say that maybe.
What are your thoughts on discussing politics in your personal statement if certain elections have greatly impacted you and how you navigated healthcare?
I think Dr. Perry should be answering this, but I would say stay away from it. But Dr.
Yeah.
Perry?
Yeah, I mean, it's dicey. Again, you don't know who's going to be reading your application. I know I've heard people say, well, if they don't want me because of I believe XYZ, then that's not a fit for me. But if this were a different kind of application situation, I would say yeah. But when you are in a situation where 60% of the people who are applying are not getting in, I would err unless it's just something you really feel strongly about to the point that you would rather not get in and at least express this. Certainly, there's something else that you can talk about, or you can couch that into advocacy, your belief in advocating for communities, in general terms where you're not saying, specifics that might be a trigger and, cause people to be distracted from your core message. I'll put it that way. It's not that we don't want political folks. We don't want people who are, are people of faith. That's not the case at all. But figure out a way, how is this something about you that shows what you would contribute to the environment? Does that make sense? I mean, I know in both of your situations, you've probably had to counsel people on how to finesse it. So it's not necessarily that we're saying just stay away from it or act like you have no ideas at all. Because we don't want to see that. We don't want to see, oh yeah, everybody's cool. I love everybody. We don't want to see bubbleheads. I don't know how have both of you kind of counseled people?
It's interesting. I've had students on when we talk about political issues, run the gamut and who have been active on campus and let's say in Republican Party things, and they're worried about applying to maybe blue state schools, that kind of thing, or somebody who's really into pro-choice or does women's health and volunteers at an abortion clinic and concern and no concerns on that person's side about where they're applying. So I've seen it run the gamut. And I do think I don't know that it's necessary. I mean, you have to be true to yourself, right? We want you to be true to yourself. Don't make something up. If this is who you are, it's okay. Share who you are. But sometimes you have to also sit back and say, is the personal statement the place where that's going to be, where you're going to share that story? Is it okay to just have that experience just be part of your AMCAS work and activities, right? And that's sufficient. You write about it there. Does it also need to be part of your personal statement? I don't know. That's where I think you have to make some judgment calls about what you're presenting.
And then we had a few people ask this question about, should we use initials or just he, she when describing experiences with patients to be in line with confidentiality?
As long as it's de-identified, even if you make up a different name, I think I've always been told that it's okay to discuss a patient as long as you provide no specific details, whether it's the identifying name or perhaps a famous football player, just as long as you keep it completely de-identified, I think it's okay.
And if you have mentors who you've worked with, a physician, you can always run it by them too. I mean, I think get advice from other physicians if you're in doubt. I've seen people put names in quotation marks. So, but the key thing is, making sure you're not, jeopardizing confidentiality. I agree.
I've seen first names used a lot, and quotation marks will take up 2 characters on each side. You only have 5,300 characters. That's -2 right there. Don't do that. So, but I also want to share on that note, sometimes I read personal statements where somebody will write about, and Dr. Perry sort of referred to this earlier. Somebody will write about working in a lab or shadowing Dr. So-and-so, Dr. Smith. The medical schools don't know who Dr. Smith is. They don't know who that person is. You can just say, if you're using that in context, just say you shadowed a cardiologist, you shadowed, I don't know, a pediatrician. You don't have to say Dr. Smith, comma, a pediatrician at the Johns Hopkins. That's too many characters. You don't need all that. And that has no context for those who are reading your essay.
Yeah, I didn't put that. Yeah, do not name drop. Don't try to impress the committee with that so-and-so. Please don't do that. It just comes off, again, inauthentic. So yeah.
Should one address grade setbacks in a personal statement or an optional essay option for AMCAS?
I have seen it. That's a great question. I have seen it very quickly woven into a personal statement with acknowledging I had to withdraw because of blah, but then I came back and did X, Y, and Z, so that it's just sort of mentioned. But I don't believe, my belief, and Dr. Perry, I think, should weigh in on this. My belief is that it should not be what your personal statement's about. Remember, you have secondaries, and you can find these secondaries. You can pre-write them. You can find them online. It doesn't mean what's appearing now as a secondary is going to be the same secondary in the next application cycle, but and medical schools do change their secondaries, but not by leaps and bounds. And you will often have opportunities in your secondary applications to discuss some of these, maybe a grade or a challenge with some grades. The other thing is some of your letter writers might be able to address some of this. If you have a faculty letter, there might be a professor who can address something in that letter.
I agree, Ellen, and I would say even go one step further on your letter writer. I've seen some of the strongest, both personal statements and letters from letter recommenders who, the person took a course from that person initially, freshman year, did horribly, took it again, and then that letter writer can speak to that resilience, can speak to that. Then they came to all my office hours. So don't shy away from that, but do direct your letter. I know we're talking about personal statements, but just think of your letter writers as your personal statements from other people who know you. Take advantage of really directing them, saying, I hope that you might choose to maybe speak on how I grew from the course that I took with you freshman year to the course that I took later, junior year, or what have you. But I agree. I've seen people do it very skillfully. But again, ask yourself, is it resolved? So I would not address negative coursework that you took, just last semester. That just, we'll see it. We'll see the grade. So you don't have to call attention to ourselves, but there may indeed be places in the application. On our application, many medical schools still have an item giving you an opportunity to discuss maybe how COVID-19 impacted you. So you can talk about that. A lot of medical schools have some item to the effect of, please, we welcome that you use this as an opportunity to address any red flags that may be on your application. So yeah, I would wait. If you are strong enough to get to that stage, where you're writing a secondary, do answer those questions and take advantage. Anything that's optional. Again, I know that's not the focus of this, but any optional essays in secondary applications, I would strongly encourage you to see them as not optional. Again, it just gives the committee even greater length, greater depth into who you are, and I would take advantage of that.
Without padding it, without the
Without
BS that
padding
you're
it.
talking
Yeah,
about.
absolutely. Absolutely. Don't pad. But if you have an opportunity to even, add to that avatar, I mean, so much of what you are submitting, it's a done deal. It's, you can't do anything now about your grade. You can't do anything now about all these other things, MCAT score, but you can give us some narrative about who you are.
If we have taken gap years, should we mention this and why in our statement?
There's always you may get asked that in a secondary essay. You might talk about it in a specific open prompt in the secondary, but kind of like the previous topic or any topic for the personal statement, if you feel that it's part of your narrative and it's an important part of your narrative, if something you did during the gap years really shifted your gears and got you on the right track, I think it's worth talking about. But just to bring it up and mention it, I think it should be part of your story and how it helped prepare you for medical school or for a career in healthcare. I think it should be substantial.
Yeah, and I think if it's 1 or 2 years, I mean, there's no reason to write, I am in the process, like, it's just not, I mean, the vast majority of applicants, at least over here on my end, are taking a minimum of 1 gap year, if not 2.
I agree. Now it's more the norm. Yeah, I agree.
Should I talk about being a reapplicant in the personal statement, given that schools I'm applying to for the first time might not know that I am a reapplicant?
No. How about that? No, exactly. So if you're a reapplicant, I hope you're looking at your school list and rethinking your school list and applying to some schools for the first time. And there's no reason to put down that you are a reapplicant. Each school will ask you in AMCAS, they ask you, it's a school specific question. So don't write about it in your personal statement. Is that safe to say?
If we have some sort of disability such as ADHD or autism or a physical disability, is this something we should mention if it is something we have overcome challenges though?
So I'll definitely defer to Dr. Perry, but I kind of look to students and I think anything from mental health illnesses to whatever it may be, if it's an ongoing challenge and you haven't gotten to the point where you have managed it and you're still struggling, of course, I have the conversation, I'm sure Ellen does as well. Is this the right time to apply? If you've developed meaningful strategies to overcome this, and that's the emphasis of what you want to say, I think it's really wonderful to talk about that. But to just bring it up without context or letting people know that you are in a really good, solid place and you've got these strong strategies, I'm not sure it necessarily works for you. Dr. Perry.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, and I think another thing to think about, another way to look at this, because I know it's frustrating because we're still kind of talking in generalities, and I know that's frustrating. But another way to think is if you met someone, think of the time that it might take to read your personal statement to someone. If you met them face to face and they said, tell me a little bit about yourself, and you basically said what's in your personal statement, would you feel that that's the time and the place to talk about these things? Or would that be the time and the place to talk about it a little bit later on after you've established some baseline? So if you think of it that way, and just imagine yourself meeting someone, in a lobby of a hotel, oh, you're applying to medical school, tell me a little bit about yourself. And so, and again, I'm not saying shy away, and you are not legally, I want to make this very clear though, this is not a legal requirement. You do not have to tell medical schools anything about any kind of accommodations you may need. As a matter of fact, in the acceptance portion of it, that is totally separate. There's a separate office that deals with that. So please do not feel that we are looking for you to do that or looking for clues. But again, yeah, I agree. Just think of it in terms of what would you want someone to be their first introduction to you, and can you make it part of a larger narrative, or does it just kind of sit out there? But you are not required to.
Is it appropriate to discuss racial disparities in healthcare and how that inspires you to address them as a physician?
Well, topics like that, I just recently had an applicant who discussed a lot about wanting to be involved in rural medicine and helping those individuals from his background. And then at the end made a statement about sort of the system being broken and access and equity. And I asked him, what is the goal? What are you trying to convey? That as a physician, are you going to fix the system, or are you going to help work one by one? And so I usually recommend students not to necessarily address big systemic challenges or mention those things in the personal statement unless you have experience. I tend to try to just say, focus on what you want to achieve as a physician. If it has bigger impacts in terms of the community, great. But I typically stay away from these topics. I think it's hard to address in a personal statement.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we have a public health studies major here at Johns Hopkins, and we have a lot of students who, and we're in Baltimore City, and we have a lot of students who write about healthcare disparities. They write about social determinants of health. There is a lot of work that goes on here, and I read about this a lot. Again, not from the political landscape, but from the literally the volunteer work that students are doing. And so I think it depends on how it's presented, which is, I think, sort of what, Jason, I think you were sort of getting
Yeah.
at. And Dr. Perry, I'm curious to.
No, I would say, I would agree. And I would say, again, look at your whole statement. And if the bulk of it is a research paper on social determinants of health, then you've done a disservice to yourself, because I'm not admitting your community. I'm wondering whether we should admit you. So if you do decide to do that, if you decide that that's part of your passion, be sure to work that into how you have grown as a result, how that has contributed specifically to why you want to go into medicine. Just it needs to come back to you. But this brings me to mind too. I would say more about who you are, your goals, less about what you plan to do in the future, because number one, we know from dealing with hundreds and thousands of medical students that can change, your interests can change. So I would stay away from, I plan to become an obstetrician so I can do this. I plan to be a pediatrician, because you don't know, that can change. So stick more, I would say, on who you are today and how you got to this point, rather than your big plans for the future. I know people have differing opinions, but that's what I think you're safer if you focus on a much tighter time span.
Yeah, and if I could follow up on that for a second on a couple things. I do see students who do think that they they volunteer to maternal and child health, or they want to be an OBGYN, or they want to go into pediatrics. They seem to think that, and that's fine if that's what they want. And if that's part of their theme and they have experiences and examples that demonstrate that they are volunteering in the pediatric ED, and they are volunteering as a tutor in elementary schools, great. That's great. Go for that kind of theme. But I don't tell them, I would say, don't write, I want to be a pediatrician. You need to go into medical school with an open mind you are going to have clerkships that take you all over the place. And you see all kinds of things when you're out and about. So you have to keep an open mind into those experiences. And if I could say one more thing real quick that I forgot to say earlier, some of the best personal statements I have ever read have really focused on really even one location or one person. So I gave you the example of the student who was 5'4", and he talked about being an EMT in one particular night, and it focused on that scenario. I had another really great personal statement that I had read about somebody who was doing clinical research, and she talked about one patient and the patient's mother, but one patient, and the woman was not from a local US. She was an international, I forget where she was from. I don't remember, but she had come to Hopkins for treatment of something. And when I tell you, she described the way the essay was written, and the way she described this patient resonated or told the reader that she understood cultural differences and she respected cultural differences. And she indirectly talked about communication skills without saying I communicated with, or she was able to paint a picture in my mind of what this person wore, how this person reacted, just based on descriptors and one setting. So sometimes I think some of the best essays, and probably Jason, yours might be very similar with it. I don't know how your personal statements were with the examples that you gave, but it sounded like they were based on sort of one setting. You don't have to throw everything in. I want to make that really clear. You don't have to throw everything into this essay, because remember, your personal statement is, as Jason was saying, you're going to overlap experiences that are already in your AMCAS application. You don't want to repeat everything that you've already said. And you do have this entire application that has everything already listed in there. Now, as Dr. Perry said, some people might not have access to your entire application, but you don't want to repeat everything again and again and again. Find fresh ways to present your information and just keep it simple. You can have the most beautiful personal statement without fancy jargon, without lots of different scenarios and scenes. Keep it simple.
And we have time for just one more question. You mentioned that AAMC core competencies. However, given that the character limit for the personal statement is quite restrictive, do you recommend that we use one that we can relate to the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think, hopefully so have this in the back of your mind, but if you go to, I'm getting ready to write my personal statement, I'm going to look at the competencies and make sure I write a line about each one. That's the wrong way to go about it. I think it was when Ellen was talking at the very beginning, it should begin with you. So with your, brainstorming, look at, if you journal, depending on where you are in the process, if you're early on in the process, begin journaling now. I mean, as soon as you start, as you're experiencing the co-curricular activities or your work, or you're in the military and you have different experiences, write those down now so that you have something to draw on. What I think you'll find is that in the course of writing about you will see, oh, that's this competency and that competency, but you're probably not going to say, I have demonstrated resilience by fill in the blank. I have demonstrated cultural competence by fill in the blank. It should come kind of organically. We shouldn't, there's a saying like, you shouldn't see the seams. You shouldn't see the sewing in the seams. It should be very seamless, very organic that we get this picture. And really, if you have to err on anything, err on really describing you and worry less about the competencies rather than the opposite.
And the only thing that I'll add that sort of addresses this question, as well as I think there was another one about recommend replicating and writing about regurgitating information from the primary application. One activity that I ask my applicants to do is to write an autobiographical statement. And I also ask them to write their own personal or professional mission statement. And so it forces them to think about, well, what have I done in my past? What have been some meaningful experiences prior to coming to college? And then my mission statement is sort of looking for, what kind of physician do I want to be? You might identify some competencies in those essays that then you want to flush out in your personal statement.
All right, I want to thank all of our panelists today for joining us, and all of our viewers as well. The recording will be available in 24 hours on our website, and we'll see if we can get these slides available too, because I know some of you asked about that. All right, thanks again.